Here we are, pleasant winter's afternoon. The birds are chirping. I think they're chirping. Well, it sounds like them. Now, conundrum. Fancy word, isn't it? Conundrum. Now, I've been puzzled by something for a long time, and I'm sure you're puzzled by it also. If democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public, then why in parliamentary democracies around the world, both in the Western world and other parts of the globe that has parliamentary democracies, why over the last 50 years or so have the rich become richer, the poor have become poorer, and the middle classes are treading water? Think about it. We're told that parliamentary democracy is the best type of government in the world. Now, you would think in a system where the individual has the power, that's theoretically, to determine the future, why isn't individual need put above the need for corporate profit or shareholder profit? Because ultimately, in a parliamentary democracy, and the important thing is the word parliamentary, because obviously there's all types of democracy, all types of socialism, all types of communism, anarchism, whatever ism you want. A whole variety. You see, parliamentary democracy is only one form of democracy, but it is based on a simple concept, representation, and that's the key. A parliamentary democracy is a representative democracy. Every 3, 4 or 5 years, depending on what part of the world you're in, people have the right to cast a ballot, to vote, determine who will make the laws for them over that corresponding period. Simple concept, representation. Now, there have been a number of things that have actually destroyed the concept of representation. And one of the major ones is inequalities in wealth. The more wealth you're able to mobilise in a parliamentary democracy, the more influence and power you are able to wield over the parliamentary representatives. Very simple concept. He who pays the piper, or she who pays the piper, calls the tune. It's a simple concept. And that's why in a country as rich as Australia, both resource rich and rich in terms of the educational attainments of a population, we continue to struggle with some of the most basic issues like access to housing, access to food, access to health care, access to dental care. And you would think in a society where the individual has the power to choose a representative to represent their interests, that their interests would be discussed and legislated for during the parliamentary period. And obviously this isn't happening. And to a significant degree this does not happen because power and wealth are interlinked. And what causes most of the issues in our society today are inequalities in power and wealth. So the second issue, which has destroyed the concept of parliamentary democracy, is political parties. It would be one thing if electorates elected candidates to represent them. What has occurred around the world, whether it's Western democracy, Western parliamentary democracy, Indian parliamentary democracy, or any other parliamentary democracy you care to discuss, what has happened is that political parties dominate the process. So representatives do not represent the people. They represent the interests of the political party which pre-selects them to stand as a candidate. Because without support of that political party, their ability to be elected is minimal because of their lack of resources. So you've got the interlinking between inequalities in wealth and political parties, that interlink. So these are two of the main issues which prevent parliamentary democracies from actually acting on behalf of the people they represent. Then on top of that, obviously you've got all the other divisions which occur in the society. Divisions based on gender, divisions based on gender identity, divisions based on nationality, race, culture, religion, and the list goes on and on. So parliamentary democracy is a very flawed system, especially if small sections of society, like the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, are able to influence the making of the laws in our society. And that's the key, making laws. That is the role of the parliamentary representative. And when you've got a majority-minority type of situation, where you've got one political party, working against another political party, what you see is that the interests of the public, that's the many, always come second to the interests of the few. Because the few have the resources to manipulate the parliamentary process in such a way as to ensure that legislation which is passed does not infringe on their capacity to make increasing profits for their shareholders, especially their major shareholders. Because in a capitalist society, it's a private investment for private profit society, there are three people in the marital bed. There is capital, that's the shareholder. Then there's the worker who creates the wealth. And then there's the customer, or the people who needs or uses those goods and services to survive. In a country or a sovereign nation state where the sole economic system is dependent on a private investment for private profit model, what occurs is the interests of the customer, the person using the goods and services, and the interests of the worker, the people that create the profit for the investor, always comes second to the investor's need to create ever-increasing profits for their major shareholders in order to continue to function and expand and increase their economic stranglehold in society. Now Australia has a double problem. It has a constitutional problem revolving economic activity. Because there is nothing in the Australian Constitution which actually guarantees the basic necessities of life for its citizens, let alone its permanent residents? Nothing. We are one of the few constitutions in the Western world where individual rights don't exist. They just don't exist. And no rights exist regarding economic certainty. The ability to not only create the wealth, but to share the wealth which has been created. We find over and over and over again that the interests of the many come second to the interests of the few. And that's why you get that increasing gap between the rich and the poor. Because when the political system, especially the system which is designed to make the laws under which we live, is dominated by the few, then the interests of the many go by the wayside. We see this in a feudal economy, we see it in an authoritarian situation, we see it in the authoritarian states, sovereign nation states around the world. We see it everywhere. But this is what the struggle for parliamentary democracy was all about, was the struggle to give the majority the ability to survive, not just survive but actually prosper because of their access to the Commonwealth. Now Australia is a particularly nasty example of access to the Commonwealth. In the land of milk and honey, what was described as the land of milk and honey, obviously it's as mentioned in ancient biblical texts. I mean, in this country, the milk has curdled and the honey has become rancid. And this has occurred for one very good reason, because of the growing inequalities in power and wealth, because power and wealth are interlinked, totally interlinked. Now when you have a parliamentary system which is basically subservient to those sections of society that control wealth, what you will see is the reinvention of 18th and 19th century capitalism during the beginning of the industrial age, when you saw capitalism come to the fore as an economic system. So what we see today in 2024 is a reversion to the situation that occurred before working people were able to work collectively through mutual aid organisations and trade unions. To give you an example, now I don't think most of you are familiar with the Tolpuddle martyrs. There were 6 men who in 1834 were transported to Australia to serve a 7-year sentence for forming a friendly society of agricultural labourers in southern England. Now obviously there was a lot of protesting regarding their transportation to the penal colonies in Australia. Now George Lovelace, who's described as the leader of these 6 men, when he was pardoned and returned to England, some of the first words he uttered in 1837, 3 years after he'd been sent to Van Diemen's Land in Australia, highlight the same dilemma we find today, not just in Australia, not just in Western democracies, but all parliamentary democracies around the world. And his statement was, "Arise, men of England, and take your stand. Rally round the symbols of liberty. or forever lay prostrate under the iron hand of your land and money-mongering taskmasters. Transportation did not have the intended effect on me, but after all, after I returned from my bondage, my views and principles were strengthened. It is indelibly fixed in my mind that labour is ill rewarded in consequence of a few tyrannising over the millions. I believe that nothing will ever be done to relieve the pain and suffering of the working classes until they take it into their own hands. Now, this statement was made by a simple ploughman in 1837 after being pardoned for forming a union of agricultural workers at Tolpuddle in Dorchester in England. And when you think about it, nothing has really changed. Although there was no parliamentary democracy at that particular point in time in England, and although parliamentary democracy has been a feature of Australian society long before federation, what has occurred is the same things which were happening in 1837 around the world are happening today in Australia and around the world, because of the growing inequality in power and wealth. And that growing inequality is directly linked, that's right, the growing inequality is directly linked to the fact that our parliamentary representatives no longer represent the people that elect them to Parliament. They represent the political party which put them up as candidates at elections and which bankrolled their campaign. They represent the interests of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And like George Lovelace, I believe that the suffering of the working classes will never be overcome or even addressed until people take matters into their own hands. Whether they form new political parties, whether they don't form new political parties, whether they get involved in cooperatives or collectives, whether they get involved in organisations like public interest before corporate interests, which puts the interests of the many before the interests of few. The reality is that working up the right channels does not deliver results. As George Lovelace said, it is indelibly fixed in my mind that labour is ill rewarded in consequence of a few tyrannising over millions. And that's what we see in 2024. When we have a political system which revolves around parliamentary representation, which no longer has any meaning to the majority of people in this country and the majority of people in parliamentary democracies around the world. People cast a ballot, but irrespective of who they vote into Parliament, while we allow that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication to manipulate the parliamentary system through the wealth they have acquired to protect and expand their interests, we will see over and over again the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and the middle classes treading water. And one statistical indicator which highlights what's happened since the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation tsunami has swept over the country is one very simple fact is 40 to 50 years ago, for every dollar that an investor invested in a private investment for private profit enterprise, 67% of the profit would go to the workers, which made that profit, which also would go to customers, and 33% would go to the investors. In 2024, just 40 years later, for every investment dollar, 67% goes back to the investor and 33% goes back to the customer and the workers who make that profit. No wonder life has become such a struggle for so many when our parliamentary system is no longer fit for human consumption until we demand that we get back to the original proposition that representatives are there to represent our interest, not to represent the interests of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication in this country, or the 8% that part of the investment class which has benefited from the globalisation, corporatisation, deregulation and privatisation revolution that have subverted the parliamentary process.